Okay, so we gotta make sure we build a Planned Parenthood in this poor community. And this one. Oh, we need these poor people to get way more abortions. Yeah, and some more here. Okay, if we do that, we can reduce the population by millions.
This is extremely messed up.
He's attacking poor people!
I'm a brilliant intellectual.
As am I!
The two of us are sick of dealing with troglodytes, and so we moved into a bomb shelter so we wouldn't catch the stupid.
Now we pass our intelligence on by debunking YouTube videos.
We are
The Debunkers!
This is an abortion rights demonstration in 1972. People marched to demand the right to legal abortions. And the next year, the Supreme Court case Roe v. Wade granted them that right. But fast forward almost 50 years, and protests for abortion rights are still happening.
Pay very close attention to this. Thankfully, Roe has been overturned, but this video was produced prior to that point. All of the rhetoric you're going to hear from them on abortion now must be contrasted against the arguments they were making just 2 years ago. You're likely going to be hearing more safe, legal, and rare style talking points now, but this is how they discuss the matter when it's legal to kill a baby nationwide.
In essence, from Roe being decided until its overturning, virtually every left-wing op-ed, think piece, or article was about how legal abortion on demand nationwide wasn't good enough. That 60 million babies had died since 1973, but we missed a few. And that it's a tragedy that evil Republicans prevented that number from being even higher.
A lot of the fight over abortion policy centers on restrictive laws set by state governments and the courts that uphold or strike down those laws, including the Supreme Court. But the president and Congress hold a unique power over abortion access because they have the final say on the federal dollars that support it. In every federal budget for the past 43 years, among all the programs the government funds, like the military, foreign aid, and education, there's also language about something the government can't spend federal money on: coverage of abortion, except in the case of rape or incest, or if the pregnancy would place the woman in danger of death. This provision is called the Hyde Amendment, and it disproportionately affects low-income people who rely on federally funded health care.
By definition, anytime the government doesn't pay for anything, it disproportionately affects people who can afford it less. But you never hear the left taking that angle when discussing school choice or tax cuts for larger families. Nothing that helps poor people have children, just things that help poor people eliminate themselves.
Every president since 1976 has supported the Hyde Amendment by approving an annual federal budget from Congress that's included it. But the 2020 election could change this, because while one candidate supports the Hyde Amendment, the other has vowed to oppose it. The Hyde Amendment's induction into the federal budget can be traced back to Roe v. Wade. In the years immediately following this decision, the federal government paid for abortions through Medicaid, which accounted for roughly a third of all abortion procedures. But the anti-abortion backlash was swift, including in Congress. In 1976, Illinois Representative Henry Hyde proposed the abortion-restricting Hyde Amendment during an annual budget hearing. It passed with a 199 to 165 vote, ending up in that year's spending bill where it has stayed ever since, voted for by anti-abortion politicians and pro-abortion rights politicians. In every case, these budgets have been approved and signed by the sitting president.
Interesting. How mysterious. Now, why, oh why, might they continually vote for this? Probably, in part, because a majority of Americans consistently want them to vote for it. In 2023, a Marist poll by the Knights of Columbus found that 60% of Americans said they oppose using taxpayer dollars to pay for abortions, with only 40% supporting it, mirroring a 2016 poll by Politico and Harvard, which found that 58% of likely voters opposed Medicaid funding for abortion, as opposed to 36% in favor of it.
As it turns out, most Americans, even those who consider themselves to be pro-choice, don't want to be a participant in the funding of someone else's abortion. Because of all the things our taxes could be getting us more of, dead babies tend not to be at the top of most people's list.
Who would have thought?
In 1977, Henry Hyde made the intentions of his amendment clear. He said, "I certainly would like to prevent, if I could legally, anybody having an abortion, a rich woman, a middle-class woman, or a poor woman. Unfortunately, the only vehicle available is the Medicaid bill.
Good for him. He wasn't able to save the children of rich and middle-class women who would find ways to get abortions anyway, but he heroically saved millions.
Indeed. While it's more than fair to say that at a bare minimum, those who understand abortion is murder shouldn't be forced to pay for it, and to require them to do so is a violation of their religious liberty, Hyde was correct in taking it a step further. The goal isn't merely to not be involved with abortion, it's to stop it altogether.
And we're getting closer.
There's a handful of agencies directly affected by the Hyde Amendment that provide health care through federal funding, like the Indian Health Service and the Peace Corps. But Medicaid is the biggest. It pays for basic health services for just over 76 million people in the U.S. who live near the poverty line or are disabled. Part of Medicaid's funding comes from federal dollars. The other part comes from the state you live in.
Abortion care in the United States is largely driven by where you live, both in terms of the availability of services and, in addition to that, the ability of insurance to pay for it.
These 16 states will help Medicaid users cover the cost of abortion. But these 34 states and Washington, D.C. won't. Anyone seeking an abortion there has to pay the full bill. That means nearly 8 million people of childbearing age who live in these states aren't covered for abortion services because of the Hyde Amendment. These Medicaid restrictions place the biggest burden on low-income people.
Again, anything short of unlimited funding for a government program will place the biggest burdens on low-income people. That's how money works.
We could basically quit doing the work we do if the Hyde Amendment didn't exist.
Or if you wanted to go to heaven.
Lori Roberts manages an abortion fund in Alabama, one of the most restrictive states when it comes to abortion access.
An abortion fund is an organization that helps people access abortion care.
You know what would be better than an organization that helps people kill babies?
What?
One which helps people get news.
Well then, thank goodness for today's sponsor,
Ground News! Face it, you're ugly.
But you could be ugly and know stuff about the news. Ground News is the first news comparison platform. It allows you to sort through different news stories and see how the left reports on it as opposed to the right, making you a fact-checking whiz.
You'll definitely want to check out the blind spot feature. It's an extremely useful tool that shows you specific stories that have gone underreported by the left or right.
Like this story, which alleges that Fauci secretly went to CIA HQ to influence the COVID-19 origins probe.
0% of left-wing outlets are reporting on it. If you scroll down a little further, you can see each of the news outlets that have reported on the story, as well as each of the sources' headlines and their political bias and factuality rating.
So get started by going to ground.news/freedomtunes. That's ground.news/freedomtunes. TOONS. Ground.news/freedomtunes.
Now back to the debunking.
It can be anything that removes the barriers to getting to and from the clinic. And then there's just direct financial support for the abortion procedure.
But at the roughly 3-minute mark, less than a minute ago, VOX said that anyone seeking an abortion has to pay the full bill. So are abortion funds helping to pay for these things or not?
They are paying for them, but they can't kill every infant, and of course that's a serious problem for the left.
The price of an abortion in the first 10 weeks of pregnancy without coverage is roughly $500, and it gets more expensive in later weeks of pregnancy.
Wait, so let me get this straight. Abortions that happen after 10 weeks are so insignificant as to not be worth legislating or even discussing, but they're a common enough occurrence that they need to be funded by the government and are a legitimate excuse for providing financial aid to infant slaughter.
That's a lot of money for someone who qualifies for Medicaid. To be eligible, you generally have to make less than 138% of the federal poverty line. For a single person, that's less than an $18,000 annual income. For a family of 2, it's $24,000. And for a family of 3, it's about $30,000.
Setting aside the morality of abortion and strictly arguing the financials here, as disgusting as that is, Planned Parenthood performed roughly 40% of all the abortions in the U.S. in 2022, and they set their price range for an in-clinic abortion between $600 to $800 for the first trimester. Annual reports for 2021 to 2022 state that its excess revenue over expenses was $204.7 million in 2022, its second second highest ever after 2017, while its net assets stand at just over $2.3 billion.
Why is it the pro-abortion side's problem is all with government not funding this, quote, healthcare, unquote, and not with the organization turning a profit from what it considers to be essential healthcare? Hypothetically, what guarantee do they have that organizations simply wouldn't follow the same pattern that universities did with subsidized student loans by simply increasing prices when the government offers to pay for more of it?
Because of racial disparities in our country, Medicaid recipients are more likely to be Black or Hispanic.
Ah, there it is. I knew at some point they would complain we're allowing too many black babies to be born.
They're already disproportionately likely to be aborted, but it's not good enough yet, is it?
I can personally say what it was like for me, right? I went to the clinic, I went for my first appointment, I scheduled my procedure, I wanted to have a procedure, and I couldn't. I didn't have the money in time. That doesn't mean that I don't love my child. It doesn't mean any of those things. But what it means is that I went through a lot of emotional and physical trauma because what should have been a decision that was only mine was taken away from me.
I oppose this law because it's the reason my child is alive is a wild argument.
Seriously, the optics on this are completely insane, and I'm always shocked when the left is tone deaf enough to engage in this. But let me be clear, saying, I'm upset I couldn't abort my child exposes way more about you than it does any laws that you believe are unfair.
My child is here because of the Hyde Amendment. I hate my child. F*** the Hyde Amendment. This ad paid for by Sociopaths for America.
That child and millions of other Americans owe their lives to the Hyde Amendment.
And that's not an embellishment. It's estimated that around 2 million people owe their lives to the Hyde Amendment. And that's as of 2016. While it's difficult to pinpoint exactly who those millions are, people who have lived despite attempted abortions often share their testimonials, and unsurprisingly, a lot of them are grateful to be alive, even if the left isn't.
Who would have thought?
A study of 269 women from 2015 to 2017 in Louisiana, a state that doesn't cover abortion through Medicaid, shows that 29% of women would have had an abortion had Medicaid covered it, which is the intended effect for anti-abortion advocates. Fewer people having abortions.
Can you imagine anything worse?
Whatever happened to safe, legal, and rare? Oh, was that always bull or something? Huh.
Abortion restrictions like the Hyde Amendment have made their way into other types of health insurance coverage, too. In 2010, Congress didn't pass the Affordable Care Act until it included language saying marketplace plans don't have to cover abortion. Today, these states won't cover it under marketplace plans. And these states even restrict private insurance companies from covering the procedure.
And so that more and more people are affected, and they may not even know that they've been affected until they seek abortion care.
Many people might also not know that despite restrictions on the use of federal funds, places like Planned Parenthood still manage to find ways to use federal tax dollars to fund abortions, including billing federal taxpayers for abortions in New York.
In 2008, the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services Office of the Inspectors General examined billings by family planning programs in New York. During one 4-year audit period, HHS found that hundreds of thousands of abortion-related claims were billed unlawfully to Medicaid by improperly labeling them family funding, and thus receiving the higher federal share of the reimbursement.
The types of unlawful billing identified in audits included billing and being reimbursed by Title 19 agencies for medications and/or services provided in connection with an abortion procedure in violation of the Hyde Amendment, a process known as unbundling or fragmentation.
But it's the Medicaid restrictions, both federal and state, that specifically target poor people.
Targets them for what? Not being killed? Oh no!
Abortion is like many other services. If you have means, you can either have insurance that pays for a service, or you can afford to pay for these services out of pocket. And if it's not offered in a place that's close to you, you can afford to either travel, get lodging, take time off of work, get childcare. All of those things are things that are available to higher income women that may not be available to lower income women.
Again, yes, that's how money works.
The two candidates in the 2020 election are solidly in their partisan corners on the issue of abortion access. But that wasn't always the case.
Let's just take a minute here and look at these two images of Biden and Trump. Are they obviously using a better photograph for one over the other?
I can't vote for him. He looks mean in that picture.
Joe Biden took office in the Senate in 1973, the same year Roe v. Wade passed. And he's supported the Hyde Amendment since it entered the federal spending bill in 1976. But in 2020, this is the landscape. The state you live in and how much money you have are the biggest factors in whether someone can access an abortion, which is why Joe Biden, as a presidential candidate, says he's changed his stance.
If I believe health care is a right as I do, I can no longer support an amendment that makes that right dependent on someone's zip code.
Well, you're not wrong that Biden changing his mind probably had something to do with finances.
Obviously, we're writing with the benefit of hindsight, but for the sake of keeping the audience updated, in March of 2022, Congress passed a $1.5 trillion spending bill that still included the Hyde Amendment, despite Democrats omitting it when it was submitted in 2021.
A silver lining to a catastrophic bill.
And Trump has only dug deeper in his anti-abortion position.
Well, this has aged poorly for all of us.
I notified Congress that I would veto any legislation that weakens pro-life policies or that encourages the destruction of human life.
Come back, pro-life Trump, we miss you!
It's also why the stakes for abortion policy for the 2020 election are clear. It's a choice between a president who plans to lift this barrier to abortion access for the country's most vulnerable people.
More vulnerable than unborn children?
And one who will keep the status quo at their expense.
If I were advocating for the abortion industry, I would keep my mouth shut about anything coming at the expense of the helpless.